welcome to Art History. So today begins our first lecture on the early Renaissance. So, a reminder, how to be successful in this course and most of your college courses is to take very detailed notes. You pretty much want to write down everything I say, multiple pages of notes, almost complete sentences. But you also want to come up with your own version of a shorthand. Instead of writing the full word because, you could write BC, or add, if it's a new idea, you could draw an asterisk, or it's an important concept, draw a little star next to it, etc. I recommend color coding important people and vocabulary words once you're going back through it to study. But again, try to write complete sentences, pretty much like frantically writing everything down. Because come back to reality. What we're discussing today, you're supposed to remember in detail for the cumulative final exam in December. It's just impossible. So you have to have it there in your notes. And of course, for the open notes quizzes, etc., I'll ask you to type up what you were supposed to write down for certain artworks, etc. All right, so we are looking at Italy and Northern Europe. Now, when you think of the Renaissance, you probably think of artworks such as this. Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Probably familiar with the Last Supper. You've seen references to it. The Sistine Chapel. However, that's our high Renaissance. That's our peak. We want to look at what came before. How did we get there? And we're going to start in Italy. Now, one of the things, before I go into that, there we go. One thing to note is that when I refer to present-day countries, like when I say, oh, we're heading to Italy, that is not accurate of the time period in which we're studying. What do I mean by that? So the idea of a national identity did not exist really until the 1700s. A little bit before, like 17th century, but mostly it was in our 18th century. So what I mean is if I was traveling and I went to a different country and someone asked me where I was from, I would say, oh, I'm from America. Right? That's my national identity. The idea of America, this national identity of Italy, was not in the consciousness of humanity prior to the last couple hundred years. So instead, if I was traveling abroad and people asked where I was from, I would say, oh, I'm from Houston. I'm a Houstonian. Okay? Not even so much Texas. It's more just Houston. And that's the idea of these city-states, of these political divisions run by cities, essentially. For example, we're looking at the area of Rome was under the Papal States. Milan had, and they each had their own political leaders, such as Milan had its own duke, whereas Florence is a republic. You have a king who's controlling Sicily. And so these political divisions are very different. Houston would be its own political entity that may be sometimes battling with the separate political entity of Dallas or Austin. Let's say Austin had a duke that we were constantly battling with, or Dallas had a king that we were constantly battling with. So just note that when I say Italy, that doesn't apply, or that would have been a word that wasn't used during this time period. And so we're going to be heading to the Republic of Florence. However, some key things to note with the Renaissance is the academic and philosophical interests of this time period. Prior to this, we have the medieval era. It's often referred to as the Dark Ages, but it wasn't dark. There was some great movements going along this period. But for the most part, the patronage of the arts, so those who paid for these art commissions, were the church. It was the Christian church. And so you're very limited with what can be depicted. There's not a great experimentation. Part of this is certain rules where you aren't depicting the human body in a very pleasing way, so no one is lusting after it, etc., etc. But art is very defined by these rules set about by the patronage of the church during that time period. And there's some experimentation that starts to happen at the end of it with the Gothic period. But what we have is this shift in philosophy that's considered secular, where instead of just looking to Christian theology, is that people such as the Medici, like you saw in that video about the Medici, is they're looking to the philosophy of the ancient world. And so there's this real interest in study of classical antiquity called Greco-Roman art, or just called classical art, interchange between the two. And so they're looking to the philosophy of this time period, the ancient Greeks, to determine what the meaning of life is how to live a good life, etc. And there's the mixing of those ideas with Christian principles as well, to try to complement it. But you have patronage outside of the church. The Medici was a business merchant family who are our main patrons of the arts in Florence. Without them, we wouldn't have had the Renaissance. And so you have this interest, this rise of scholars versus just the clergy being in control of these artistic interests. Oh, I should note the term Renaissance means rebirth, FYI. Now, I want to focus on this idea of humanism throughout this unit and the High Renaissance. And it's really, if I were to summarize it, it would be this philosophical belief in human potential, in your own individual potential. So what that means is you as an individual, you're trying to pursue what you're meant to pursue. If you're an artist, then you're trying to constantly pushing yourself to experiment and to discover and to figure out how to create better art than what you had before. So we're going to see that play out in art. This is why the Renaissance occurred, was this idea of humanism, of this interest in human potential with whatever you're doing. And so that's an important factor to consider. And I want to start with this piece to help us really define the changing interests of the Renaissance. Yeah, and we're going to also introduce a lot of new art history terms that you are not familiar with. So initially, much of art history may sound like a foreign language, but you will learn it. So, hooray. Note that on your handout, there are many key terms and concepts. So if you miss something that I say, it's likely on the handout or on the slides, or you can go back into the video. So this is the sacrifice of Isaac. And it was for the gates of paradise, this competition. Sorry, I said for the gates of paradise, but these were the doors for the Baptistry and San Giovanni in Florence. So Florence has these really cool examples of architecture, this very definitive black and white color scheme. But so this is a Christian building. It's the Baptistry. We'll find out throughout this the course of the semester that water is sacred for many, many cultures. And so we see that here, this idea of baptizing in water. And so here we have this Baptistry house. And so there's this competition for, who will design these bronze doors. All right. So Brunelleschi on the left and Ghiberti are two of our main artists, our main sculptors who are applying for this commission. They want to win this. I mean, this is an important building. So if you want to get your name out there and earn more commissions, you want to get one of the very public works. And so here's an example. So I'm going to give you a minute, and I want you to pause the video and skim through each of these artworks. And if you were on the panel of judges, would you choose Brunelleschi or Ghiberti? Which one do you find more aesthetically pleasing? Okay, so every year, the majority of my students say that they like Brunelleschi's on the left better. There are some that do like Ghiberti. And one of the reasons why so many people point out when I ask, why'd you choose Brunelleschi? Is they say there's less going on. And when we compare the two, this background creates this almost sense of chaos because it's a little more busy. Now, guess who won? Ghiberti. So many students are very surprised by this. But the reason why is because, remember, during this time period, they're looking to ancient Greek and Roman art. So much so that artisans are even part of their training is they are studying in Rome and they're looking at these artworks. Now, what we want to consider are these sarcophagi on the left. Sarcophagus singular, sarcophagi. These ancient Roman sarcophagi that were found. And if you'll notice, they have this very busy look to them that we were just referring to. And so this is the idea of a term called horror vacui, in which there's no negative space. Everywhere that you look, there's some type of object. There's a tiny bit of negative space here. We could argue that here. But for the most part, it's very busy. There's no negative space. So there's one of the many reasons why Ghiberti was chosen. I want to talk about figure style as well. So if we're comparing the two, let's look at Brunelleschi and let's look at Ghiberti. Looking at Brunelleschi, consider how our main figure is somewhat realistic, but that his face looks very baby-like, with these very rounded cheeks. How this angel has these very rounded cheeks. Versus Ghiberti, his body is very idealized, which means it's in this idealized, supramuscular state. It looks really realistic. And his face is a little bit of this less rounded baby face that we see over in Brunelleschi, and it's more of this ancient Greek look to it. Because again, we're looking to classical antiquity. So Ghiberti had won this commission. Let's come back to, before jumping back into a formal analysis of why he won, I want to talk about this patronage. Is that it's for the baptistry, but it's patronized, which means it's paid for by the Wool Guild. Okay? So during this time period, whatever type of craft you're involved in, you have to go through this series of steps to be able to become a master. And even then, for you to actually get any commissions, any jobs, you have to be a member of the guild. It was part of essentially a law. Think of like today, if for any type of, well, even for school, like if you're going to pursue your 12 years of school, and then you're going to go get an undergraduate degree, you may have an internship somewhere in there, and then you can apply for these jobs. So there's these series of steps for craftsmen during this time period. And to help keep things regulated, prices determined, etc., for you to actually get any of these jobs, you have to make it into the guild. And so the Wool Guild is full of all these people involved with wool. They're very wealthy. Florence gets cold during the winter. Consider how even today wool is an expensive material. And so this is a wealthy guild. And so they're the ones who are actually sponsoring this artwork. And so it's a testament to their wealth. Most of the works we look at are also power moves, essentially. They're showing off. But what I also want to note is that Ghiberti himself is displayed on this artwork. So you see him right here. Okay. Now, this is such a testament to the rising status of the artist during the Renaissance. Prior to this, if you had taken last semester, there were very few actual artists that we were able to identify and study. Artists didn't sign their names. They were on this lower level. They weren't as revered as how we revere artists today for their talent. But we see this shift during the Renaissance. And that goes along with this idea of humanism, of these artists are pursuing these extraordinary pursuits in the arts, and so they're being recognized for that. And so this is such a testament that the artist himself is on here, the creator. I should also talk about the story of this. So, coming back to our wool merchant. So they've patronized this work of art, and this specific scene was their contest. And so, with this scene, it's a scene from the Old Testament, this story. It's from the Old Testament in Christianity, it's from the Torah in Judaism, or it's from the Quran in Islam, all stem from these Abrahamic religions. And so this is the story of Abraham, this older gentleman, and he was told by God that he would need to sacrifice his son Isaac to prove his loyalty. Now this may sound shocking or barbaric, but when you consider every single religion essentially has this component of sacrifice. Even in Christianity, Jesus Christ, the founder, sacrificed himself. He died for the greater good. And in all of these religions, even today, there are numerous religions that still practice the sacrifice of animals, this idea of blood sacrifice. And so we see this with Abraham, where he's told to sacrifice his son. So he brings him to the top of this mountain and this altar. And right before he's about to do it, an angel stops him. And there's this idea of he's proven that he will be loyal. He doesn't have to stop them. Instead, he may sacrifice a lamb. Okay, or a sheep. Who was our patron of this work? Oh, the wool guild. So here's this important element of our wool, essentially, and this important biblical story involving it. Okay, so let's come back to this figure style. Okay, we already discussed how Ghiberti was chosen because his body looks more realistic, his face looks more realistic and Greek-like versus our rounded baby cheeks of Brunelleschi. I also want to introduce some other terms. So this term contrapposto refers to this natural standing position invented by a Greek artist, Polyclitus. You don't need to know that, but it was utilized during much of the time of the Romans, of ancient Rome, especially during the Empire. And so what that is consider you're observing how someone stands. If you're talking to your friends, you're not going to stand in a very rigid, tall pose, looking very uncomfortable. Instead, if you're talking to someone, you're going to automatically shift your weight into one of your legs. Okay, so consider how this Greek sculpture, he has shifted his weight into his right leg, and therefore his left leg is going to bend slightly, his hips come at an angle, his shoulders angle in the opposite direction to create this balance in the body. This is an extremely naturalistic pose. And so when we consider, look at these figures, how this is like an exaggerated contrapposto where his weight has shifted into his left leg as he's talking to this gentleman on the horse, where Abraham himself has shifted his weight into his right leg. Okay? So this Greco-Roman classical element of this standing contrapposto pose is seen in our Ghiberti and not in our Brunelleschi. Okay. So again, patron is the wool guild. They're very wealthy. All right, let's do a formal analysis. So remember, a major component of your grade for Lone Star is a formal analysis over a chosen work of art from the MFA. If I were to, let's say I chose this artwork, my three strongest formal elements would be line, figure style, and space. So what do I mean by that? This is where your eye is drawn toward, or how these formal elements communicate the overall message of this piece and where they draw your eye around this piece. So let's start with line. My eyes are likely drawn to the center of this piece, the action, right? Where Abraham has this knife going to his son's throat, angel stops him. So let's start with line. We're going to look at diagonal, curvilinear, rectilinear. And so what you have is this diagonal line, Abraham's arm that extends out, and then the cloth that being blown by the wind behind him leads my eye up to here, and then down this cliff in the diagonal line of his body, down to this figure, and then we have this curvilinear line. My eye is drawn downward to the horse. Oops. Then there's this diagonal line up, and this rectilinear line coming across the back, curvilinear line of the tail, back up this figure, curvilinear to the center, up over to the angel. And so Brunelleschi has used line to draw our eye across the artwork. Okay, your eye may have been gone the opposite way, but either way, he's done this extremely intentionally. And again, he won out partly because of the figure. He lost because of the figure style. Sorry, it's much more these rounded baby cheeks that are going on. He has an extraordinary skill, hence why so many people chose him. Look at how he can create these different poses of the figures and how talented he is. But he just doesn't have the same classical figure style as our Ghiberti. So the body is not idealized. They look pretty naturalistic, except again for the faces of Isaac and the angel. They have realistic proportions, but just the faces are too rounded, essentially. There's this element of space. We have a foreground, which is closest to the viewer. We have our middle ground, and this idea of depth created on a three-dimensional surface is done by these overlapping figures in terms of where the horse is slightly overlapping this altar. And then you have a little bit of a background with this rock cliff face here. But there is this sense of space. Okay, let's talk about Ghiberti. It's more classical. We talked about the lack of negative space. These artists are seeing it on ancient Roman sarcophagi. Now again, one of the reasons even why Brunelleschi is so popular is because of that use of line and how our eyes drawn around the artwork in a formulaic way. Versus Ghiberti, there is this sense of line. And we've got our curvilinear line coming up to the angel, arguably down back to Isaac. Our eyes are drawn around. Consider the curvilinear line of the horse and the figure standing closest to us, the viewer, to this other figure, and up to the sheep associated with the Will Guild. Yeah, he has a little bit more of this foreground, middle ground, and background to an extent. Okay, this line. And we talked about the figure style. It's much more classical. And especially this idealized body, okay, is I mean, when you think of ancient Greek, you probably think of these flexing, very fit Greek sculptures. And so here we have this Greek body here. Of course, is this realistic? Is anyone who's about to be murdered flexing every muscle in this position? Not necessarily, but it's the idealized version. Another term I want to introduce is that this is a relief. Okay, so it's not a full sculpture that you would walk around. It's obviously not a painting or anything. It's a sculpture that's carved out of the wall, or in this case attached to this back panel. Yeah, it was carved out slightly, not a sculpture in the round. You can't walk behind it. It's attached to the doors. Also, the other terms of high relief versus low relief. So you're looking at the majority of the artwork. High relief is where it protrudes very far away from the back wall. So most of this is high relief. So I'm going to say it. I'm going to describe it as high relief, where I could like wrap my arm, obviously around behind this extended arm because it is completely separated from the wall. But other parts, basically when you see a lot of shadow, like here, I could wrap my hands slightly just around the corner edge of this high relief. Okay, so you're looking at it as a whole, and that's how you determine it. Versus this relief as a whole is low relief. It does not protrude as much. Okay, compare the two. It's barely carved away from the wall. Okay, so this one, for the majority of it, is high relief. Okay. This is especially when there's a lot of shadow. That's a tell. All right, so you may have been upset if you were for Team Brunelleschi. However, Brunelleschi's fine. He makes his name in the art world. He chooses never to sculpt again. He's so devastated by not winning out. But this forces him into other roles, and he becomes this extraordinary architect. No prior experience, he creates the largest dome. Even today, it is the largest dome, mason dome, in history, or created of masonry. And at the time period, it was the largest for centuries. And so he does make his name for himself. He also creates the concept of linear perspective in painting and art. He really defines it. So he does make his mark in art history. So here's the dome of the Cathedral of Florence. After numerous failed attempts, several attempts at this dome had collapsed. And then Brunelleschi is hired to create it. Notice how it just towers over the skyline of Florence. It stands out even to this day. So you have an assigned video over this artwork. For a lot of architecture, I like videos because I feel like you just really can't get the full experience without, or on a two-dimensional picture or painting without seeing the videos of it. So again, part of their studies were heading to Rome to study this Greco-Roman artworks and architecture. And so he had been to the Pantheon. Now the Pantheon was the largest dome for centuries and centuries. Look at this, 118 to 125, up until Brunelleschi. So we're 1,400 years later. And so this was the largest dome. It was this extraordinary feat, and one of the few ancient Roman temples that was not destroyed, again, because of this dome. It was used as a church for a while because of how extraordinary this was. And so Brunelleschi created his dome. All right, so you'll watch that video for your assignment. Notice how the exterior is its own dome, and then interior rib. Your video will go over this. Okay, so let's talk about Brunelleschi's linear perspective, which changes art. So consider back to humanism. You're thinking about human potential. And you as an artist, you're thinking about the potential of art. And how do you create an idea of the concept of depth, or this idea of three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional surface? How do you create depth? How do you create space? How do you create the volume of objects and beings and bodies, etc.? Well, here we have linear perspective. So if you go out into the hallway of any large building and you look down the hallway and you look at the very other end, it's going to look like there are these diagonal lines that lead to a single point at the very other end of that hallway that you're standing. And so let me introduce these terms, and I'll go into them actually by another artist's artwork. Is this vanishing point. Here's where your eye is drawn to this focal point. Your horizon line, now look out anywhere and you've got a horizon line, and your diagonal lines that lead to the vanishing point. This is your orthogonal line. Orthogonal lines. Here's an example of an artist you're more familiar with, Leonardo da Vinci. He was planning out this artwork. So he has all these orthogonals, your horizon line leading to your vanishing point, your focal point. So Brunelleschi invented this concept, but I'm going to use Perugino's Christ Delivering the Keys of the Kingdom to illustrate it. It is like your key artwork. If I say linear perspective, I want you to think of this artwork. It also helps us reinforce a lot of the concepts and priorities and what the Renaissance values. So this is from the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican. It's up here, over on the left on this wall. All right, so new terms. First of all, let's consider the composition, okay, how this artwork is arranged. So our eyes are likely drawn to the center because of this building. The gold color draws our eyes to it. Right before the Renaissance, a defining element of the medieval era is this idea of gold, and it's associated with the heavens. It's oftentimes on the roof of the domes in these churches, etc. So our eyes are drawn to this building because it's centrally placed, because of the color. It's lighter than the other buildings, but also because this is where our vanishing point is. Look at how our orthogonal lines are led to here. This is extremely intentional. Talking about the composition before we go back into linear perspective, this is a pretty symmetrical artwork, where if we were to divide it down the middle, it's not an exact mirror image, but where there is this sense of symmetry. And that helps to create this idea of balance. We have these two triumphal arches on either side. When we look at the figures, they're pretty balanced. On the left versus the right. We have this use of numerous colors, but especially the primary colors, so it's just aesthetically pleasing. It all feels balanced and orderly. We have a clear linear perspective here. So there's this emphasis on linear perspective. And so what you need to know is that these orthogonals lead your eye to the vanishing or focal point. And this horizon line here. Okay. This creates a sense of depth, realistic depth, on a two-dimensional surface. Another term I want to introduce is this idea of atmospheric perspective, and where if you were to walk outside and you look off into the distance, the farther you look, the smaller objects are going to look, as well as they're going to become a little blurry, right? Things look a little hazy in this background. Does that mean that there's a fog rolling in? No, it's just the way how our eyes perceive space. These objects closest to us on the picture plane in the foreground are the largest. They're closest to the viewer on the picture plane. We have our middle ground. These figures start to get a little smaller. And we have our background with how much smaller these figures look. And our background becomes hazier. It's less clear. So these new terms of how to create a realistic sense of space of depth on a two-dimensional surface. Now let's recap on some of the Renaissance elements of this. So remember, they're interested in classical antiquity. So consider the outfits of all these individuals in the foreground versus the more Renaissance outfits of many of these individuals in the middle ground. And we also have these triumphal arches, which were utilized by the Romans after winning a major battle. The predecessor of like that general or whatnot would create these triumphal arches to honor that victory. And so we're pulling directly from these triumphal arches in Rome. This, of course, was within a Christian context, and so just to introduce a popular story, is the idea of Jesus giving the keys to the church to St. Peter, the first pope. And so the idea is that each pope has this lineage from St. Peter, who is given this authority by Christ. So hence why this scene is centrally placed here. And they're all in what type of pose? So many are in contrapposto pose. Vanishing point, horizon line, orthogonals. See how things get hazier. Here's our linear perspective. Vanishing point, as in it's not like the artist has drawn a dot to draw your attention there, but your eyes understand where he's leading you. Our contrapposto pose, back to our Doryphoros from ancient Greece. Almost exactly. Here's one of the triumphal arches of Constantine outside the Colosseum in Rome, which you would have seen. I briefly just want to show the Palazzo Rucellai to hone in on this idea of symmetry, of balance, of order, and how these secular patrons of art are not trying to show off. This was commissioned by a prestigious architect, but it's not very flamboyant or ostentatious. The interior, we can imagine, is quite incredible, but where they aren't really showing off on the exterior. Go back, consider that video that I had assigned that focused on the Medici and the ideals of the Renaissance, is how they're trying to use the arts as a way to pursue living a better life, of encouraging this thoughtful way of living. And so we see this blending here. Consider this symmetry and this order. It doesn't look chaotic. We also have these engaged columns that mimic the Greek orders of columns. If you took last semester, I think Doric, a little bit of Ionic, Corinthian. If you're new to this semester, you don't need to write that down. Just note that the style of these columns mimic the classical orders. The arch was created by the Romans, and so we see the arched windows here. Granted, that had also been used during the previous period of the Romanesque and Gothic. At night. And there's a storefront on the front. Corinthian capitals. Okay, so you've probably heard of Donatello. Now, if not as an artist, maybe one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But let's check out his famous artwork. So, David. This is a bronze sculpture. And here is, remember how we were talking about with that relief and high and low relief? And I said it's not a sculpture in the round. This image is a sculpture in the round, where you are asked to walk, you are supposed to walk around it. I have two different paintings of the same, just different lighting to show the details. So it was patronized by Cosimo de' Medici. So we're looking at an artwork patronized by the Medici. And this is really important because it's both a religious image and a political image. So this is a really famous story of the Old Testament, or again from the Torah, the Quran, of the story between David and Goliath. So there's this big battle raging, and it comes down to where they're going to, between two individuals, to decide the outcome of this war. And Goliath is this massive giant. He seems undefeatable by the other side. And then you have this underdog young man, David, who physically cannot even compete with this giant Goliath. But where he takes his slingshot and he uses this rock to hit Goliath in the head and kills him and wins this battle. So it's this real underdog story. And so what we see here is David after winning this battle. Let's talk about the figure style and why this is intentional. So first of all, it's likely not individualized, new term. It's this very generic Greek face. I mean, look how this looks like these Greek sculptures. So we have the classical element, check. Looks like a Greek face. But we have our contemporary, which means popular at the time, headdress and hairstyle, okay? Because they're still, he wants to see part of what's popular during that time period. What he's standing upon is the head of Goliath. So Goliath looks big, he has this huge helmet, okay? David is standing right atop of his head, and underneath them is this victory wreath, which was really utilized by the Romans to show victory. So classical element, check. Okay. Versus, again, David doesn't have a war helmet, instead he just has a hat. So he's clearly the underdog. Also his figure style. So again, this is a sculpture in the round, you're meant to walk around it. So let's talk about his body. It's realistic, but it's not our very swole, super physically fit, prime of his life, idealized version. We can see realistic muscles, but he is meant to look pretty less idealized, less muscular, to really illustrate how he was the clear underdog. He's thinner, he's skinnier, he's not this swole Greek sculpture that we think of. And the purpose of that is to emphasize how much of the underdog he was. Now, why is this being celebrated? Why did I say this was political? So, Florence had been at war with two other major players, one of which was the Duke of Milan. The Duke of Milan was trying to take over Florence. Essentially, the plague wipes through Italy, killing off their enemies, including much of Milan. And so Milan gives up. And so the Florentines win against their war with the Duke of Milan. They were the underdogs during this whole battle. I should have emphasized that right from the beginning. That Florence, we're looking at the arts, we're looking at the patronage, we talked about the guilds, etc. We weren't talking about the military capabilities of Florence. That's not what they were known for. It was a big merchant city. Wealthy and coveted by others, obviously, because they were trying to conquer it. And so they were the big underdogs. So with this win, Florence saw David as pretty much their patron person. They associated with this idea of the underdog winning against the giant, despite all odds. And so David is going to be symbolic of Florence for centuries to come. So here is our David. Another important factor is this is the first nude sculpture since antiquity. During the whole medieval era, pretty much from the 4th century up through, the 14th century right before this, you didn't see any nudes. Remember how I talked about with the Christian patronage, is this was so that people wouldn't lust after the naked body. And so you're not seeing that. Now, one of the reasons why this nude work was commissioned is because it was apparently placed within his courtyard. So he would have brought important businessmen and people invited to his house, etc., but it wasn't out in the public for public display. So David's the symbol of the Republic of Florence, the underdog who beat the Duke of Milan, and we have this clear contrapposto pose. It's this homage to classical Greek antiquity. There is an argument to be made by numerous art historians of these erotic undertones, of him being somewhat androgynous. Also, the feather that is fixed atop Goliath's helmet reaches up to his inner thigh, which is arguably pretty erotic. Again, this would have been in a private setting. Part of that is because Cosimo de' Medici was a homosexual. It was more accepted in Florentine life, so for his private use. As many argue that was the purpose of that. And that victory wreath. Oh, he has the Florentine boots that were popular. And then here we have our David. And we will continue tomorrow.